Well, today I'm talking to Patrick Titley, who's had a long and distinguished career in broadcasting, but quite an unusual start. And Patrick, I'm going to take you right back to the beginning because you actually started as a maths teacher, didn't you?
I did. I did maths at university, which I was extremely bad at. And in order to scrape through the degree, I also did a teaching certificate, which I was better at. And so when I left university, yeah, I was a maths teacher in Bristol for about a year and a half.
Something must have sparked an interest in TV. First of all, what sort of era are we talking about here? When are we talking about?
Yeah, the 18th century. No, it was the 1970s.
Right, so quite a different landscape then. But just tell me how you got the bug, the television bug, which
Well,
obviously
I
stayed with you.
so when I was at university, I joined the theatre group, which was called Bath University Student Theatre, or BUST for short. And in I think it was the end of Christmas of the third year, there were amazingly, even in those days, the university had some technicians who had a little television camera, and they used to do a monthly kind of magazine show about the university. And they wanted to do a Christmas special, and they needed two student actors to be in it. It was an hilarious comedy. And I volunteered with a friend of mine. And I remember thinking while we were doing it that that job looked like a lot of fun, filming things. I grew up in a little town in South Devon called Exmouth and had no interaction with film or television or crews whatsoever. I don't think film crews even knew Exmouth was there. I certainly don't remember ever seeing one or have anything to do with one. So it was a completely new experience for me to see a sort of crew at work and think about what it meant. So in my fourth year, when thoughts come to careers and jobs, I did actually apply to the BBC. I think the only thing open at that time was to be a trainee radio studio manager or something like that. So I did apply for that, and then I got a letter saying that they'd actually cancelled it that year. I don't think just because I applied. I think they cancelled it for everybody, which seemed slightly disappointing. So I then did, what I was supposed to do with my qualification and became a maths teacher. My girlfriend's mum actually was the person who spotted an advert for trainee camera assistants in the Daily Mail. And you can't imagine that now, can you? There being a job advert in the Daily Mail for being on a camera crew. But she sent it to me, and I applied for that and got it, which was fantastic. I remember the first interview was in, I was living in Bristol, and the interview was actually in Cardiff in the Angel Hotel. And there was a chap from the engineering department called Mr. Seymour. You can see it was quite a stressful thing, so I can remember it really clearly. And he asked me some quite tricky questions. I remember one of them was a circuit diagram, and he said, what's the voltage across that resistor? So I worked it out and, said very confidently 47.5 volts. And he said, no, actually it's 9 volts, but tell me how you worked it out. And he said, oh, yes, there's your mistake. So, and it went downhill from there, really. I couldn't answer any of the questions. The one I really remember is he said, if you were sitting in a theatre in an aisle seat, and in the aisle next to you was a television camera, what would you see that the television camera wouldn't see? And I had no idea. And then I thought, oh, yes, of course, peripheral vision. No, said Mr. Seymour. Okay, and he did that thing that interviewers sometimes do where he just sat there silently while I kind of stewed away. And I honestly couldn't think of it. So in order to help me, he said, it's the main purpose of television lighting. Okay. So that didn't help me at all. And then eventually he took pity on me and he said, well, of course, you would see in 3D and the camera only sees in 2D. In retrospect, once I started working in telly, I realised that that was a very sort of engineering view of what television lighting is for. Anyway, at the end of the interview, I really thought I'd messed up, and I thought it was like my only chance. And I remember saying to him, "Look, I'm really sorry. I I've got physics A level, but I haven't done any physics for 5 years, and I'm teaching CSE maths, and that's the only thing I kind of think about at the moment. And he said to me, I can tell you, Mr. Titley, we only take the best in the BBC. So I went home very, very sadly, and much to my amazement, got offered a second interview. Of course, for the second interview, I then boned up on all the questions, got a book out of the library. For younger people, that was like Google, but written down on paper. And they actually asked the exact same questions, which was the funny thing at the next interview, including the exact same circuit diagram. And so they offered me a job, and initially in Cardiff, but they actually said to me, why do you want to work in Cardiff? And I said, well, I don't really, but I thought that was where the job was. And they said, well, we can probably transfer you to Bristol, which they did, which was very good of them.
So obviously you said something, Patrick, which impressed the BBC. And so what did that lead to? What was your first job?
So my first job was as a technical operator. In fact, as a sort of subdivision of that, a trainee camera assistant. And the first thing that happened was I went to Evesham, to the training centre, for 3 months. I think it was called the A course, and I think it was something like A49. On the course were both TOs, technical operators, and TAs, technical assistants. And the difference was technical operators were operational. Obviously, technical assistants were kind of more on the engineering side and not actually operational in terms of programs. The course was in 3 sections, and the first 2 sections you did together, and then the third section, the TAs, did something else, and the TOs concentrated on the operational things. And I remember particularly from Evesham, the first time we went into the television studio and were allowed to operate the cameras, which were EMI 2005s, I think they were called. And they had sort of quite big lenses at the front. And I remember operating the camera and then having a completely sleepless night because of the excitement of it. That idea that you could frame a shot and, change focus and zoom and things like that just seemed fantastic to me. And I just thought about it all night. And I then, from Evesham, went to Bristol as a trainee camera assistant, worked on the crew in Bristol. We had 2 studios in Bristol. Studio A, which was the kind of network studio that generally hosted programmes from London. There were a few sort of local programmes made there. And we had Studio B, which was the local news, Points West. And as the kind of most junior camera person, I spent time in Studio A kind of almost learning on the job by being on the crew. The main part of the job actually was cable bashing, which is, I guess, a technical expression that camera crews use, but basically making sure the cables, were clear, didn't get tangled up and so on, and were in a safe state. And also we had a camera crane called a Heron crane, which needed 2 people. The camera operator sat at the front, it was all hydraulic, and the second person stood at the back and steered it around. And so I spent quite a lot of time as the Heron tracker, and fantastic learning experience to work on so many different television programs and just learn from them. And in Studio B, I was actually allowed to operate a camera, which was fantastic. So I would often be on sort of camera 3 on the local news, and it was exciting because it was live, and I learnt an awful lot there about live television and the importance of the director keeping calm. It was absolutely fantastic.
I worked in regional television myself in Manchester, so I know what the excitement was like. The excitement is coming through for you and for people watching television today, where there aren't any camera operators in the studio. They're all, in the high tech ones. It's all robotic. Just describe for me that kind of feeling. I'm getting a sense from you that compared to your maths teaching, which are obviously very rewarding, but this was immensely exciting. Just talk me through what it was like in the studio in the 70s.
Well, it was remarkably similar to how it is now in terms of the actual operating. I mean, jumping ahead, ended up as a studio director. I also then was a university lecturer. I always used to say to my students, the technology's changed, but the actual way you make the program is exactly the same now as it was then. All that really matters are stories. I think the key thing in the regional studio was there were several directors. They were actually called production assistants in those days. They were really what we now call assistant producers, but the BBC term for them was production assistants. They ranged from, the excellent to the terrible. And again, that was such a fantastic learning experience. To see the difference between a good director and a not so good director was really useful. It also was an opportunity to try things out. So I was able to learn vision mixing in that first year because the studio was empty a lot of the time. I mean, on a normal day, we were scheduled in at 11 o'clock in the morning and we just did nothing until 5 o'clock when we started rehearsing for the live show at 6 o'clock. I can't remember whether it was 6 or 6:30. The studio was sitting there empty a lot of the time. And what that meant was you could play, and I used to go and play on the vision mixer because, I found the vision mixer absolutely fascinating. And I would learn how it worked and press all the buttons and see what happened. And that got noticed. And the only other thing we used to do was the afternoon news, which again was something like 4 o'clock. And production assistants who were supposed to direct it, they saw that as a real chore, because what they really wanted to do was go off and make films. And they hated having to be in the studio. And one of them said to me, why don't you ever go at doing the afternoon news? It was actually in my second year, but I started directing the afternoon news because I really enjoyed it because it was live and it was really good fun because you did your own vision mixing. And I worked out, this is a bit technical, but we used to have to opt out from network. And sometimes the signal was synchronized, in which case you could opt out anywhere and it didn't really matter. We were opting in, actually. You were taking the network feed through your vision mixer. So instead of the network feed going straight to the transmitter, it was now going through the set of buttons in front of you. And you flicked a switch to make that happen. And sometimes it was gen-locked. And when it was gen-locked, it didn't really matter when you flicked the switch because it would stay synchronized. If it wasn't gen-locked, if you flicked the switch, you'd get a picture roll as it sort of relocked into your mixer. I hope that kind of makes sense. And I worked out that when it wasn't gen-locked, I could do a really clever thing because they used to fade down right at the last minute. They were always on a clock and they would fade to black and then fade up. And we used to do that locally. We would, fade down the network clock and then fade up our presenter. But I realised that on the old mixers, you could split the mixing knobs so that the mixer output was actually black. And I realised that if I waited to opt out, or opt in, until they'd faded down on network, I could flick the switch, fade up, and then we didn't get any picture roll. And the engineers were really worried about it because it's like a real last minute thing. If I'd messed up flicking the switch, we wouldn't have been on air. But I said, it'll be fine. Leave it to me. And luckily they did. And I felt quite proud of that I'd worked out a way of making a non-rolling picture that wasn't gen-locked. Sorry, I got a bit technical there. But
I understand exactly what you're saying. Was that deemed to be a good thing from your bosses, or were they?
I don't think the bosses even noticed or cared. But it was like a kind of pride thing. It was that using the kit to do something that other people in Bristol hadn't thought of, I felt quite proud of. I don't know if you know about the job of station assistant, but it was a brilliant job for learning because that was my second job. So I was a camera assistant for a year, and in the summer of that year, they closed down the main studio to put in a new floor. So the studio was closed for 6 weeks, and they basically said to the crew, well, you don't really need to come in. And all the kind of older camera guys were like, oh, great, 6 weeks off in the summer. I, of course, didn't want that. I wanted to do stuff. So I used to go and make a nuisance of myself to the scheduling people. And it just happened they needed a stand-in station assistant in regional. So I did that for a couple of weeks, and again, really enjoyed it. Fantastic job. You are what it says, a station assistant. So you do floor managing is the main part of the job. You floor manage the live news. If you're not floor managing, you're in the gallery preparing graphics. In those days, we used to use a lot of slides. And so you'd go out with a stills camera and take stills and create slides of sort of news stories that they didn't want to send a crew for. You would do a thing called swinging grams on mute film. So the regional people, they had 2 proper camera crews with a sound recordist, and then they had 2 mute crews that didn't have a sound recordist, so they didn't record sound. So they would send, obviously, the proper crews on the big stories. But if it was something fairly small, they would send a mute crew because it saved money. It's basically a one-person operation. And when that film was played in the news, to make it sound like it had sound on it, I stood at the back of the studio with some 2 record players, Grams machines, 2 cassette players, and I would play in sort of live sound effects. And again, that really interesting job, because you got to go to the cutting room and see the film, often backwards at speed when they were rewinding it, because they didn't really have time to stop and show it to you. But at least you had some idea of what was in it. And then you'd go to the record library and you'd get out the correct kind of sound effects discs. The hardest thing was when they sent the crew to film something that had effectively synchronous sound, and you somehow had to cover it. And I remember it was a story about some fences being built. I can't remember why, but they sent the mute crew, and he filmed this guy sort of hammering fences in. So of course, from my point of view, how am I going to put sound on somebody hammering the fence? So I found a hammering sound effect, but because it didn't match the speed at which the guy was hammering on the film. So I lined it up to play like the first sound of the hammer. And then I just got some general noise over it. And I actually got called in to the boss for that one, complaining to say, why didn't you put sound effects on it? And I had to sort of explain to him that it's impossible. If, that it doesn't match. If you want sound effects on that, you have to go to a recording theatre and do it properly. I think the highlights, they sent a crew to cover a steam train. It was, they were steaming some engine for the first time. And the mute crew covered it. And I discovered we had a background sound effect called Provincial Town Atmosphere, Prov Town. And I discovered if you faded Prov Town, if you rammed the fader open and then brought it down slowly, it sounded exactly like a steam train. And I was able to actually synchronize that by watching the pictures as it went out live, and opening and fading it down, opening and fading it down. I matched the sound of the steam train. And afterwards, I was really sort of pleased with myself. Of course, nobody said well done, because they just assume it was filmed with sound. So it was a rather thankless job from that point of view. But like I say, a fantastic kind of learning experience.
So Patrick, you're getting really valuable experience in Bristol, but obviously at that age you're getting itchy feet. So where you wanted to move on, what was in your mind? Which direction did you want to go in?
Well, I'd really looked at all the jobs. I have to be honest, I'm not really a great camera operator. I don't have incredibly good psychomotor skills. I realised basically camera operating wasn't the thing that I would be good at. And looking at the other jobs, it seemed to me being a director was the best job, because you're right at the sharp end. It's very creative and it really looked like a lot of fun. And I suppose I felt I would be reasonably good at it, because when I was being a floor manager as a station assistant, I found I was able to do that job quite creatively. So I thought, well, I'll start looking around to see how you become a director. Now, the BBC, of course, had the fantastic attachment system where you could try out somebody else's job for 6 months. Fantastic idea. So you applied for them, they were competitive. But if you got it, you went and did another job for 6 months. You didn't get sort of extra pay, but it gave you a chance to try the job out. And more importantly, it gave the people who were running whichever department you went to a chance to see what you could do. So I started applying for assistant producer attachments. And just again, to be clear, assistant producers, in most departments, there wasn't an actual job called director. The directing was either done by producers or by assistant producers. So in most departments, being an assistant producer meant you would do directing. So I applied for 3. I applied for presentation in London, which was to be a network director. They're the people who are directing the entire channel, directing BBC One. I applied to BBC Norwich to be a regional AP, and I applied to a department called Continuing Education, only because they were the 3 that happened to come up while I was thinking of doing this. I was interviewed for all of them, and I actually got offered all of them, but I decided to go for Continuing Education because it was making programmes, which the presentation one wasn't, and I'd actually been in regional and I wanted to do network. So that's why I went to London initially for 6 months to work in continuing education. And I worked on a slightly odd programme for teenagers, as we used to call them, called 16 Up. And I got the chance to try my hand at actually directing. The producer of 16 Up at the time was finishing off another series, which was called Old Dogs, New Tricks. And it was about older people taking up new skills. And it was presented by a chap called Tom Vernon, who had a radio show called Fat Man on a Bicycle. And Tony Matthews, who was the producer of 16 Up, he said to me, I'm doing this day's directing, and I wondered if you'd like to, direct half of it. And of course I said yes. And the bit I did, it was Tom Vernon going to an Italian barber's in Soho and trying out the Italian that he'd been learning. And it was all set up. I mean, literally all I had to do was direct it. I did so much preparation. I mean, I hung around Soho and I worked out, I knew that if you were doing a travelling shot, the thing travelling had to go from right to left in every shot, or from left to right, but it had to be consistent. It couldn't go right to left and then left to right. It had to be right to left, right to left, right to left. So I planned all this in immense detail. Tom on a bike, I worked out all the shots. I felt very well prepared. And then we were allocated a lighting cameraman called Philip Bonham Carter. And that was the great thing about the BBC in those days. You would get a crew who were in between big jobs. So Philip Bonham Carter was renowned as a drama camera person, very well known, did all the really big dramas. And obviously between the big jobs, they got allocated to us. So you can imagine how I felt knowing that my first ever sort of proper directing with a film crew was going to be with this amazing person. The upshot of this is I was filming in the afternoon. I was directing in the afternoon. So Tony directed in the morning. Lunchtime, we went to Soho and I took over. Tony very kindly sort of left me to it as well. He didn't hover over my shoulder. Anyway, we did the first couple of shots of Tom Vernon cycling from right to left. Worked really well. We set up in Dean Street to film the last shot where he cycled to the barber's. And I explained the shot, Tom's going to cycle up the street and he's going to stop outside the barber's. And the camera assistant said, oh, that won't work, Gov. And I said, yes, it will, because we've done right to left, and he's going to go right to left, stop outside the barber's. And the camera assistant said, yeah, but it's a one-way street. So in all my planning, I hadn't noticed that you can't cycle right to left on Dean Street because you can only cycle the other way. And I got a bit flustered. And Philip Bonham Carter, who's a lovely man, he said, don't worry about it. Why don't we do this? We'll have Tom push the bicycle up the pavement, right to left. And I thought, yes, that'll work. And I realised then, very, very important lesson, that it's teamwork. Up until that point, I'd sort of felt that the director had to do everything, that everybody there just did what the director said. It's that sort of very odd Hollywood, autocratic thing. Not that I was being autocratic, but I sort of felt I had all the responsibility. I realised that's not true. It's teamwork, and a good crew will always make suggestions and help when things go wrong. And, nobody can think of everything, and things change as well. So that was my sort of first experience with a proper crew, and a very enjoyable one.
So you're getting a taste for programme direction and making programmes, and two of the programmes that really stand out in your career are Micro Live and Take Nobody's Word for It. Just tell me about those.
Yes, I was very lucky to be asked to work on the computer literacy project. The computer literacy project, I'm sure most people know, involved the BBC having its own microcomputer, the BBC Micro, and there was two television series that accompanied it. The first one called The Computer Programme, and the second one called Making the Most of the Micro. And I was asked to work on Making the Most of the Micro as an assistant producer, mainly directing on location and in the studio. I really enjoyed it. It was the first time really that I'd done a programme about technical things, and I absolutely loved it. I had a science background, obviously, at A-level, and I really enjoyed getting involved with an engineering, a technical type programme. And in fact, my career after that, I really specialised in doing science and engineering shows. And Making the Most of the Micro was a really enjoyable show to do, but I missed doing live television. There's a thrill about being live on air that you just don't get anywhere else. And I had a cunning plan. So I went to see David Allen, who was the sort of series editor on the Computer Literacy Project, and said, why don't we do a live version of Making the Most of the Micro? And I said we could do a phone-in. People could phone in with questions. We could have our sort of normal guests could be there as a panel, and it would be really good fun. And David went with the idea, and we got it commissioned, and we did 2 hours live on a Sunday morning, Making the Most of the Micro live, it was called, so very creatively. And it's slightly famous in the annals of computer history because we got hacked live on air. We asked people, as well as phoning in, we asked people to give us questions on email. And in those days, we had a very early version of email called British Telecom Gold. And we all had accounts that started BBC. I was the lucky one who had BBC 007, password Bond. Oh, shouldn't have said that. And we set up a special account called Owl 001, because the owl was the symbol of the Computer Literacy Project. And we asked people to send in emails. And live on the programme, one of our guests, a chap called John Coll, went live to the Owl 001 inbox to see what questions people had left. And as he clicked on it, it kind of flicked on the monitor, and it said, "You've been hacked." And then there was a thing called Hacker's Song, and we were hacked live on air. And like I say, in the annals of nerddom, it's quite a kind of famous thing. We did a follow-up Making the Most of the Micro live about 9 months later, and off the back of that, it became a series. Initially, we did 6 programs once a month, and then it became a weekly show. Brilliant. Doing live television with computers in the studio. Everybody was really worried about things going wrong. If we got sort of guests in to show us some software running on a PC, say, their first question was always, can we pre-record it? And we always said no. If your software's not good enough to run in the live situation, then you shouldn't be selling it. We didn't actually say that, but that was the thought at the back of our heads. And I think we did 3 or possibly 4 series of it. I only did the first 2. I did some great things though during it. Got to meet and interview some really interesting people. Bob Moog, who created the Moog synthesizer. We used to do sort of filming trips. So we went to Boston to do a filming trip and filmed various stories around Boston. And we filmed an interview with Bob Moog, absolutely lovely man. He worked for a guy called Ray Kurzweil at the time, who had set up an artificial intelligence company. And one of their products was a reader for blind people. And we were kind of doing the story about the company and how this reader worked. And we were allowed to interview the great man. He was too important to kind of come and hang around while we set up lights. We had to be completely preset. And then he would deign to come and sit in the seat and we could ask him questions. And I said to him, how does the reader for blind people work? Because it can read any font when you put a book on it. So how does it, know how to read different fonts? And he said, well, it is, he was German, by the way. He said, well, it's what I call the principle of anus. So letter A has an anus about it. And by this time, of course, the crew was sniggering. So I said, I'm sorry, Dr. Kurzweil, I'm going to have to stop you there. He said, why? I said, well, could we do that again? And this time, could you use the letter B as the example? He said, why? And anyway, that's what we did. Then after Micro Live, I was again very lucky to work on a show that was invented by a guy called George Auckland. George was he was an AP on Blue Peter, I believe, and came to our department. But he came with a great idea, which was to make a show that did home science. So it was a science program, but it was all about things you could do at home. Science you could do at home, experiments that you could do at home. Fantastic idea. And we spent, again, it's amazing looking back at it, we spent a year making 10 episodes of that show, culminating in going into the studio. So we did all the pre-filming, and then over a course of 10 weeks, literally went in the studio every week, made an episode, and it went out the following week. What I remember about that, particularly the first episode, we had two presenters, Carol Vorderman. It was actually her first, I was said to her it was her first proper job, because it was the first job that wasn't a game show. And a guy called Professor Ian Fells, who was Professor of Energy Conversion at the University of Newcastle. I knew him because he'd been a guest judge on a show called The Great Egg Race. And they were great presenters. We also, every week, had a guest scientist on the show. And it was Felsey, actually, who suggested that we got the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to be the guest scientist, which seemed like an extraordinary idea. She was a research chemist before she went into politics, so there was a sort of justification for it. But how would we get her? Well, Felsey actually knew Bernard Ingham, who was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary, and he said, look, leave it to me, I'll phone. So he phoned Ingham. Ingham was interested. Thatcher agreed to it. And then I had one of the most surreal days of my entire life. I was sitting in the office in Ealing. The phone went. I picked it up, and a voice said, "Oh, hello, it's number 10 here." I said, "Oh, hello," stood to attention. And the voice said, "Yes, the Prime Minister is very interested to do this film with you, but she'd like to see a script." So I then spent the afternoon typing a script, and it said, "The Prime Minister is boiling up red cabbage water." And I stopped and I thought, I can't believe I'm typing that line. And then I wrote, the Prime Minister explains that it can be used to indicate acid or alkali. Anyway, we sent the script off, probably by fax in those days, and they liked it. And they said, yes, the Prime Minister would like to do it, but she'd like a rehearsal. So just before Christmas, George and I and Professor Fells, who was going to be the presenter, went along to number 10 Downing Street. Again, I remember it. You remember the sort of small things, but George had a gigantic kind of canvas bag full of stuff he needed for the experiments that Margaret Thatcher was going to do. And it kind of clanks and so on. And nobody looked at it. I couldn't believe. I kept expecting people to say, right, we need to check your bag. Nobody did. We went into number 10. We had a brief chat to the press guy. He took us up to the flat. And then the Prime Minister came in. Now, she was absolutely charming, as it happened. And as Felsey said, all politicians are, really, because that's how they become politicians. But the thing I remember about her is I was very nervous. I mean, I was in my 20s, very young, really, to be directing the Prime Minister. And Felsie introduced us because he knew her vaguely. And he introduced me and said, "This is Patrick, the director." And she shook my hand, she looked me in the eye, and she said, "Now, please, just forget I'm the Prime Minister and tell me exactly what you want me to do." And that was such a charming thing, actually, because it did free me to then be a director and say, "Okay, stand there, put the saucepan there, do this kind of stuff." So we rehearsed it. It went very well. She asked lots of interesting questions. And then when we finished, she said, "Now you must all come and have a drink." So we trolled up to the private living room, and she poured us a gin and tonic with her own fair hand, and we sat there making small talk. And again, what a wonderful job to be in television and get to do stuff like that. And then we went back after Christmas to film it. The filming went very smoothly. The only things I remember about the filming really is that they were very insistent that we didn't film towards the window. And the reason was they were worried about the IRA, and they didn't want any clues seen through the window to indicate where the window was in relation to the building, so it could be targeted. And the second thing was they had their own sound recordist, which, in retrospect, actually makes sense. But they had their own sound recordist who recorded every time we recorded, so that they had a record of what the Prime Minister had actually said. Anyway, we then we did the filming, went very smoothly. George and I then had to go down to Bristol to make the first episode. So we were what was called a hosted series in Bristol. What it meant was the studios in London were overstretched, and Bristol had spare studio space. So even though we were a London production, we were basically sent to Bristol to make the show in the Bristol studio. The problem was we had to edit the film the same week that we were in Bristol. And we had a rather zany film editor called Horatio Quiro. And Horatio was Argentinian, and this was just after the Falklands War. I mean, I'm sure that wouldn't have affected it, but I did kind of plead with him not to do anything zany. I said, we haven't got any time. We were absolute deadline. So we were in Bristol for the whole week. The absolute deadline was lunchtime Saturday, midday Saturday. The film had to be sent to the lab by midday Saturday. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the show prints ready to go into the programme, which was transmitting the following week. And I pleaded with him. I phoned him from Bristol, and he kept saying, "Oh, no, it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine." So we got back from Bristol Friday. Saturday morning, I went into the cutting room, and Horatio showed me the cut. And it was absolutely fine, apart from he'd used an outtake. And right at the beginning, the first shot we did was a sort of wide shot of the Prime Minister lifting the pan of red cabbage water off the stove and decanting it into 3 wine glasses. And as she did it, she spilt some. And she got really flustered, and she said, "Oh, no, I can't bear an untidy kitchen." And she got a cloth and so on. And I'd actually cut, because she was flustered. I'd cut. I said, let's do it again. So we'd done a second take, which was absolutely fine. But Horatio had used the first take, and then obviously cut through to the second take. And I was terrified. I mean, to make the decision to use an outtake, I just didn't know what to do. Now, you might be thinking, surely there was somebody more senior. But in those days, you were trusted as a producer. You were sort of left to your own devices. The BBC had a great system called referral upwards. You only, if you were worried about something, you referred it upwards. The problem was there was nobody around. No executive producers wanted to come to the cutting room on a Saturday morning. Can't imagine that now. The execs would be all over it. But the only thing I could think to do, I phoned Professor Ian Fells in Newcastle at home, and I played it to him off the Steenbeck over the phone. And I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Dear boy," because that's what he used to call me. He said, "Dear boy, I think it's absolutely fine. I think she'll like it because it makes her look human." So we left it in, and sure enough, it was fine. Now, that film obviously got a lot of publicity. It was shown all over the world. A clip of it was shown on Entertainment Tonight in America. That first episode got an audience of something like 4.5 million people on BBC Two at 7:30 in the evening. Huge audience. Because the issue was, all those people who turned on to see the Prime Minister didn't turn on next week. So the second week, our audience dropped to like 2 million, which was, still a respectable audience, but it didn't look so good, that our first episode, it dropped away so much. And that was taking his word for it. Yeah, great fun show. And in fact, there was a second series of it, but I'd actually left the BBC by then, so George produced the second series.
Incredible story. As you say, you did leave the BBC. You went to become head of children's and education for Yorkshire Television, and then deputy controller of children's programmes for Granada Media. You've produced and directed many programmes since then, which have earned you a BAFTA, an RTS, and medals from the New York Film Festival. So, looking back at your BBC time, you obviously look back with affection. Does it feel like a different era to modern technology, or are you just grateful for the start it gave you in what turned out to be a brilliant career?
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I think both of those things are true. I think I was very lucky to work at the BBC at a time when it was at the kind of height of its powers. Television Centre was a buzz. I can't tell you how exciting it was to walk into Television Centre. You could walk round on the second floor, and there were viewing rooms for each studio. And you could literally, there were 8 studios, and they'd all be in use. You'd have Top of the Pops in one studio, Doctor Who in another studio, Grandstand getting ready in another studio. It was the most exciting time to work in television, I think. The BBC was sort of awash with money because of the colour licence fee. It was a time of technological change. Digital recording equipment was just coming in. One of the most shameful things, actually, as a director, this is a slight red herring, but they bought in a machine called a Quantel. That enabled you to do things like sliding the picture off. Instead of doing a mix, you could slide the picture off. And everybody started to use it as a transition. And when I look at it now, it's the most horrible transition you can imagine. But we all did it because we could. But it was exciting. Portable video was just coming in. I mean, we shot on film, 16mm film, for a very long time. The sort of early days of my career were all 16mm film. Even at Yorkshire, it was 16mm film to begin with. It wasn't really until the 90s that we started to have portable video that was usable instead of film. I mean, it was fantastic to work on film. You had all that sort of history, but it was so expensive. A single roll of film in those days, processed, was something like £120 off your budget, and it only lasted 10 minutes. So every time you shot 10 minutes, 120 quid came off your budget. Now, I worked out for a lecture I was doing once, that's the equivalent nowadays of a half-hour tape costing about £900, and it wouldn't be reusable. It was always the biggest line on your budget, and it really made you concentrate. And I think from the point of view of learning how to direct, that was a really good discipline. Only rolling when there was actually something worth filming. I work now with younger camera people who didn't come up through film. And the difference, I mean, they just roll the camera and don't even think about it. Of course, the drawback of that is you get to the cutting room and there's tons of stuff you don't want. So that discipline, I think, was like a really, really useful thing. And I think I look back on it partly with nostalgia, partly with a sense that I was so lucky to work on those particular shows at that particular time. And partly, I think, with the kind of sense of joy, really, that we were able to do the things we were able to do and experiment and try things out and have fun, really, as well as work.
Patrick, a great pleasure to talk to you. Patrick Titley.
Thanks very much, Colin.